A quiet night had settled over the suburban streets. The air was crisp, the kind that sent a slight shiver through anyone venturing outside. Streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the pavement, while houses stood still, their windows glowing faintly. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything felt safe, predictable, where nothing ever truly went wrong. Until now. At 7:30 p.m., Jane Bashara had sent her last text message. It was short, routine, something about wrapping up work and heading home. Then, silence. Her colleagues had expected her at a late meeting, but she never showed up. Calls went straight to voicemail. Texts remained unread. It wasn't like Jane to go off the grid. She was the kind of woman who always answered her phone, who kept her schedule neat and precise. By midnight, concern had begun to spread like ripples in water. Something wasn't right. At home, her husband, Bob Bashara, sat in their well-furnished living room. The house was warm, cozy, filled with the subtle scent of pine-scented candles. He was watching television, his feet propped up, a half-empty glass of bourbon resting on the side table. If he was worried, he didn't show it. When Jane's friends and colleagues began calling, Bob answered with a casual tone, dismissing their concern. She probably just got caught up with something. Maybe she's visiting a friend, he said, offering the kind of vague reassurances people give when they don't want to make a fuss. But Jane had never been the type to just disappear. By morning, the unease had turned into a gnawing dread. Calls to her phone still went unanswered. The messages remained unseen. And then, something strange happened. Her Mercedes-Benz SUV was found in an alleyway in another part of town, miles away from where she was supposed to be. The doors were locked. The vehicle was undamaged. Nothing had been stolen. But Jane wasn't inside. The only thing that was certain? Jane Bashara was missing, and no one knew where she was. A winter morning unfolded over the city, the sky a vast stretch of dull gray. The air carried the bitter chill of a season unwilling to loosen its grip. In Grosse Pointe Park, the world stirred as it always did. Joggers huffing along tree-lined sidewalks, coffee shops opening their doors, neighbors exchanging brief greetings before slipping into their daily routines. Everything felt normal, except it wasn't. Miles away, on the east side of Detroit, a sanitation worker named Darnell Hayes maneuvered his truck into a narrow alley. He had driven this route for years, navigating past rusted fences and faded murals, past forgotten buildings where broken windows stared blankly at the streets below. It was the kind of place where nothing good ever happened, where time had settled into a slow decay. And yet, as he pulled forward, something caught his eye. A black Mercedes-Benz, parked awkwardly near a dumpster, its presence jarring against the backdrop of neglect. Darnell frowned. Luxury cars didn't belong here. He let the truck idle as he stepped down, his boots crunching against frost-bitten pavement. The vehicle's tires were slightly turned, as if it had been left in haste. Its doors were shut, the windows tinted dark. He knocked on the glass, then knocked again, harder this time. No movement. Instinct told him to walk away, to mind his business and get back to his route. But something felt wrong. He hesitated, leaned in closer, and through the tint, he made out a shape in the back seat. His breath caught. The angle, the stillness. It wasn't right. Shifting slightly, he squinted, and his stomach lurched. A woman was slumped across the seat, her body motionless, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. He stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs. The morning silence seemed to press in on him, suffocating as realization sank in. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking as he punched in the number for emergency dispatch. When the operator answered, his voice came out hoarse. I think there's a dead woman in this car." By the time Detective James Calloway arrived, the scene had already drawn a small crowd. Strangers lingered at a distance, curiosity keeping them rooted in place despite the cold. A pair of uniformed officers were securing the perimeter, their expressions grim. Calloway adjusted his coat against the sharp wind and stepped closer, the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. The car door had been pried open by first responders, revealing what they already suspected. A woman dressed in business attire lay crumpled in the back seat. Auburn hair framed a face that had once been full of life, but now seemed almost waxen, her skin pallid in the dim morning light. No visible signs of struggle, no blood. Her handbag sat neatly beside her, untouched. Her jewelry remained undisturbed, a picture of eerie stillness. Something about the entire scene felt too neat, too carefully placed. He had seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't add up. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. Someone had made sure she would be found, but not immediately, long enough for the body to be discovered by chance. They found her identification in her purse. Jane Bashara, a respected businesswoman, a wife, a mother, not the kind of person expected to turn up dead in an alleyway on the wrong side of town. Calloway took a long breath before stepping away. It was time to notify the family. Bob Bashara arrived at the precinct an hour later, his expression a mix of disbelief and devastation. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the chair across from Calloway's desk. He kept shaking his head as if rejecting the very reality of what he had just been told. "This doesn't make sense," Bob muttered. She wouldn't be in a place like that. She was supposed to be at a meeting. I don't understand." His voice cracked, and for a moment it seemed as though the weight of his grief might pull him under. Calloway watched him carefully, studying the way his fingers twitched against the tabletop, the way his eyes darted between the detective and the floor. The grief appeared real. It felt real. But Calloway had been in this line of work long enough to know that appearances were deceptive. "When was the last time you spoke to your wife?" Calloway asked, keeping his voice even. Bob exhaled, dragging a hand through his graying hair. "Last night. She said she had a meeting after work, something with a client. She texted me before she left. That was it." "No phone calls?" "No." A pause. I texted her later, but she didn't answer. I figured she was busy. It was late. I went to bed." Calloway let the silence settle between them for a moment before leaning forward. "Did Jane mention anything unusual recently? Was she worried about something? Did she seem uneasy?" Bob hesitated, then shook his head. Everything was fine. We were fine." It was a simple answer. Too simple. The detective knew from experience that fine was rarely the truth. Fine was what people said when they didn't want to say more, when they needed to keep the real story buried just a little longer. And something about Bob Bashara's version of events wasn't lining up. As Calloway stepped out of the room, his mind was already racing through the possibilities. A woman like Jane didn't just end up in a place like that by accident. Someone had put her there. Someone had wanted her to be found. The only question now was who. The day after Jane Bashara's body was found, Grosse Pointe Park felt different. The air carried a weight that hadn't been there before, a thick unease that settled over the neighborhood like an unwelcome guest. The Bashara home, a stately brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street, looked the same as it always had. Neat, respectable, the picture of suburban normalcy. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, something had shifted. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the house with wary eyes. Reporters had begun circling, sniffing for a story. The illusion of perfection had cracked, and everyone could feel it. Inside the precinct, Detective James Calloway sat across from Bob Bashara once again. The initial shock of Jane's death had begun to settle, but the questions remained, the kind that gnawed at the edges of logic, whispering that something wasn't right. Bob looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, his shirt slightly rumpled as if he hadn't slept. A man in mourning, a husband grappling with an unimaginable loss. But Calloway wasn't convinced. "Mr. Bashara," he began, his tone careful, measured, "we're trying to piece together Jane's final hours. Anything you can tell us, even something small, could help." Bob nodded slowly, fingers laced together on the table. I told you everything. She had a meeting after work. I don't know who it was with. She was supposed to come home, but she never did." "Did she seem different lately?" Calloway asked, watching him closely. "Nervous? Stressed?" Bob shook his head. Everything was normal. She was happy. There it was again. That word. Normal. Calloway had worked enough cases to know that normal was usually a lie. He leaned back in his chair. Jane was found in an area miles from here, Mr. Bashara, a part of town she had no connection to. That doesn't seem normal to me. Bob exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't know how she got there. The detective let the silence stretch, waiting to see if Bob would fill it. When he didn't, Calloway made a note to himself. The less someone says, the more they're hiding. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Another officer leaned in, speaking low enough that only Calloway could hear. We need you in the conference room. Something came up. Bob looked up, eyes wary. What is it? Calloway stood, his expression unreadable. We'll be back shortly, Mr. Bashara. Just sit tight. Bob didn't protest, but the detective caught the subtle way his hands clenched into fists before he quickly relaxed them again. A tell, a small one, but a tell nonetheless. As Calloway stepped into the hallway, the officer handed him a folder. We got access to Jane's phone records. There's something you'll want to see. Inside the conference room, Calloway flipped through the papers, scanning the last few outgoing texts Jane had sent. Most were mundane, work emails, quick check-ins with friends. But then, at 7:12 p.m. on the night she disappeared, she had sent a message to an unknown number. I need to talk to you. Urgent. It was the last message she ever sent. Calloway's eyes narrowed. Whose number is this? The officer hesitated. We're still running it down. It's a burner. Of course it was. That made things more complicated. People didn't use burner phones unless they had something to hide. Calloway tapped the file against the table, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Who had Jane been desperate to reach? A friend? A colleague? Or someone she wasn't supposed to be talking to at all? One thing was clear. This wasn't random. Jane had been afraid of something, and whatever it was, it had gotten her killed. That evening, Calloway and his team returned to the Bashara house. Bob had been allowed to go home, though he remained under close watch. He answered the door with a weary expression, stepping aside to let them in. The house was pristine, almost eerily so. Family photos lined the walls. A candle flickered on the kitchen counter, filling the air with a warm vanilla scent. If one didn't know better, they'd think nothing had ever gone wrong here. Bob folded his arms, his posture tense. What now? We'd like to take a look around, Calloway said. Just routine. Bob hesitated for the briefest second before stepping aside. Fine. Calloway and his team moved through the house with quiet efficiency. The living room was meticulously arranged, the dining table set as if expecting guests. Nothing seemed out of place until they reached the garage. The moment Calloway stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier. It smelled of oil and metal, but there was something else underneath, faint yet unmistakable, a chemical scent. He turned to his forensic tech, who was already pulling out a detection kit. Get a sample. As the tech worked, Calloway's eyes landed on a small dark stain near the base of a shelf. It had been scrubbed, but not well enough. He crouched down, running a gloved finger over the spot. Even under dim lighting, he could see the discoloration. Luminol, he said. The tech nodded, spraying the solution. Moments later, a faint blue glow illuminated the concrete floor. Blood. Someone had tried to clean it, but the truth had a way of lingering. Calloway stood, his gaze shifting back toward the house. Bob was in the kitchen, watching them through the doorway, his face carefully blank. The detective had seen that expression before. It wasn't grief, it was calculation. And suddenly, Calloway knew. Whatever had happened to Jane Bashara, the answers weren't in the alleyway where she was found. They were right here, inside this house. The air inside the Bashara garage felt thick, the kind of suffocating stillness that came when something was terribly, undeniably wrong. Detective James Calloway had been in this situation before, standing at the threshold of a crime scene disguised as an ordinary space, knowing that beneath the carefully constructed surface, something sinister lurked. The faint glow from the luminol had confirmed what he already suspected. Blood had been spilled here. Someone had tried to erase the evidence, to scrub away the truth, but forensic science had a way of reaching into the past and pulling secrets back into the light. As the forensic techs worked meticulously, Calloway scanned the garage with fresh eyes. The walls were lined with neatly arranged tools, each one hanging in its designated place. Shelves were stacked with labeled storage bins, their contents hidden behind plastic lids. It was the kind of setup that suggested control, a place where everything had an order, a place where nothing happened by accident. He turned toward the workbench, his gloved hands brushing over its surface. There were faint scuff marks, barely noticeable, but enough to suggest that something heavy had been dragged across it. His eyes followed the faint trail to the floor, where he imagined how it had played out. The struggle, the fall, the desperate attempt to cover it up. Stepping back, he surveyed the garage with a broader lens. If Jane Bashara had died here, then the alleyway where she was found was nothing more than a staging ground. Someone had moved her body, placed it deliberately in a location that didn't make sense for a woman of her background, hoping it would lead investigators down the wrong path. But there was a problem. The body had been too pristine, no defensive wounds, no broken nails, no sign that she had fought back. It suggested she had been subdued quickly, efficiently. Calloway's gut told him this wasn't the work of a reckless criminal or an impulsive attack. This had been planned. Someone had thought through every detail. When he stepped back inside the house, Bob Bashara was waiting. His eyes flickered toward the forensic team as they moved in and out of the garage, collecting samples, taking photographs. There was tension in the way he stood, his arms crossed too tightly over his chest. Calloway studied him for a moment. "Did Jane ever come into the garage much?" Bob hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really. That was more my space." It was an innocent enough response, but paired with everything else, it only deepened Calloway's suspicions. That night, as the detective reviewed the day's findings, he felt the case shifting. Jane's death wasn't a random act of violence. The evidence was telling a different story, one of premeditation, one of deception. The key now was finding the missing link, and that link was somewhere in Jane Bashara's life. The deeper Detective Calloway dug, the clearer it became. Jane Bashara had been living in a world that was far different from the one everyone believed. From the outside, her life had seemed like the perfect portrait of suburban success, a loving marriage, a beautiful home, a stable career. But perfection was often a façade, and behind the carefully curated image, shadows lurked. Forensic results from the garage confirmed what the detective had feared. The blood belonged to Jane, not a trace amount, not something that could be dismissed as accidental. Enough to suggest that she had suffered a violent end inside her own home. That meant everything that happened afterward, the relocation of her body, the carefully staged crime scene in the alleyway, had been a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. It was no longer a question of whether her death had been an accident. Someone had killed her, and whoever had done it had planned carefully. The problem with carefully planned crimes, however, was that they relied on the assumption that no mistakes had been made. But mistakes always happened. It was Calloway's job to find them. He began reconstructing Jane's final hours, tracking every step she had taken that day. Phone records placed her at work until the evening, where she had exchanged routine messages with colleagues. Nothing seemed unusual. But then there was that last message, the one she had sent to a burner phone at 7:12 p.m. "I need to talk to you. Urgent." Someone had been expecting that message. Someone knew what Jane wanted to talk about, and yet there had been no response. Calloway needed to know who she had reached out to, what she had been so desperate to say. The problem was that burner phones were designed for anonymity. They were used by people who didn't want to be traced, people with something to hide. As he pored over Jane's digital footprint, another pattern began to emerge, one that made his pulse quicken. Her search history had been wiped, not just selectively, but entirely. There was no record of her browsing activity in the days leading up to her death. That wasn't something the average person did. It was something done with intent. Either Jane had erased it herself, or someone had done it for her. Then there was her financial activity. Bank statements showed an unusual withdrawal, a sum of cash taken from an ATM just a day before she died. Not a massive amount, but enough to suggest that she had been preparing for something. A meeting? A payment? A contingency plan? The missing pieces were piling up, but the picture they formed was still blurred. Then Calloway received a call from the forensic team. "We found something in the garage. You're going to want to see this." When he arrived, the techs had already cordoned off a small section near the base of the workbench. They had been using a forensic vacuum, a tool designed to collect microscopic fibers and debris from surfaces that had been disturbed. What they found was chilling. Beneath the layers of sawdust and motor oil residue were traces of black fibers, ones that didn't match anything else in the garage. They were synthetic, the type used in high-end carpet or upholstery. It wasn't from Jane's clothing. It wasn't from anything commonly found in a garage, but it was a perfect match for the interior lining of the Mercedes-Benz SUV where her body had been found. The implication was undeniable. Jane had been in the garage after her death. She hadn't just been attacked there. She had been moved. Someone had taken the time to transport her body to the car, ensuring that any evidence left behind could be controlled. That was why there had been no struggle, no defensive wounds. She had been incapacitated before she was killed. Calloway's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about covering up a crime. This was about control. Detective Calloway had worked enough homicide cases to recognize when a crime had been committed in the heat of the moment and when it had been carefully orchestrated. Jane Bashara's murder belonged to the second category. Someone had gone to great lengths to stage the perfect misdirection, to erase the real crime scene and place her in a location that didn't match her life. The person responsible had confidence, control, and a belief that they could manipulate the truth. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on: mistakes. The forensic team had already uncovered blood in the garage and fibers from Jane's vehicle, proving that her body had been moved. But Calloway needed more. He needed the moment where everything unraveled, where the lie that had been so carefully constructed collapsed under its own weight. That moment arrived on a cold evening, when a man walked into the precinct and changed everything. Joseph Gentz wasn't the type of person who typically inserted himself into a police investigation. He wasn't a concerned neighbor or a grieving friend. He was a handyman, a man who had spent his life fixing things, repairing what was broken. But as he stood before Calloway that night, his hands trembled. His gaze darted toward the corners of the room as if he expected something or someone to be watching. "I need to talk to someone," he muttered. "It's about Jane Bashara." Those words alone shifted the entire investigation. Jentz's story came out in fragmented, uneven breaths, like a dam that had been holding back too much water for too long. He spoke about an offer made in hushed conversations, a proposition he hadn't known how to refuse. A man had approached him, someone he trusted, and had told him that there was a problem that needed to be handled. That problem was Jane. At first he had brushed it off, thinking it was just talk, just words spoken in frustration. But then the man had made it clear. This wasn't a joke. And soon after, Gentz found himself standing inside the Bashara garage. He remembered the way Jane had looked at him, confusion flickering across her face, turning to fear as realization set in. He recalled the struggle, brief and one-sided, and the terrible silence that followed. The next thing he remembered was standing in that same garage, looking at her body, his heart hammering in his chest. The man who had orchestrated it all had been there too, instructing him, telling him what to do next, where to take her, how to make it look like something it wasn't. And then he said the name. The moment it left his lips, the room seemed to contract around Calloway. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside his mind was racing. He already knew. He had known for a while. But now he had proof. The weight of Joseph Gentz's confession settled over the investigation like a thick fog, clinging to every aspect of the case. His words had unlocked something, a narrative of control, manipulation, and betrayal. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, there were still gaps, questions that needed answers. Detective Calloway didn't believe in coincidences. Crimes like these were rarely impulsive. They were calculated, crafted by someone who thought they had covered every trace of their involvement. But no crime was perfect. The forensic team had already provided Calloway with damning physical evidence: the blood in the garage, the fibers from Jane's car, the erased search history on her devices. And now Gentz had given them something even more valuable: a story. Calloway had heard countless confessions throughout his career, some genuine, others crafted by people seeking attention, trying to involve themselves in something larger than their own lives. But this confession was different. It had details that no outsider could fabricate, descriptions of events that lined up too perfectly with the timeline they had reconstructed. And more importantly, it introduced a chilling new layer to the case. Jane Bashara hadn't just been killed. She had been executed. Calloway replayed Jence's words in his mind, dissecting every part of his account. The way Jane had looked at him when she realized what was happening. The moment of panic. The way she had pleaded. The way it had ended. Fast, efficient, devoid of hesitation. This wasn't just about removing Jane from the picture. It was about ensuring she never had the chance to fight back. It was a crime committed not in rage, but in cold, mechanical precision. Jens described how he had been promised money, assured that everything would be taken care of, that no one would ever find out, that this was simply a problem that needed solving. And then there was the cleanup, the calculated movements of someone who had done everything in their power to erase any sign that Jane Bashara had died in that garage. It was all starting to make sense. The staged crime scene, the abandoned Mercedes-Benz, the location where her body was found, it had all been meant to tell a story, a false one, a version of events that would send investigators down the wrong path, away from the one place they should have been looking from the start, the Bashara home. For Calloway, this changed everything. They weren't just looking at a murder anymore. They were looking at something deeper, something darker, and the person responsible was still walking free, still pretending to be the grieving husband, still playing his role, but not for much longer. The walls of the interrogation room were deliberately bare. No distractions, no comforts, just the sterile weight of reality closing in. The dim fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows, deepening the lines of exhaustion on Bob Bashara's face. He sat with his shoulders hunched forward, his hands resting on the table, fingers splayed as if bracing himself for impact. He knew why he was here. Detective Calloway had seen this moment play out in countless investigations. The moment when the carefully constructed version of events began to crumble. Some suspects cracked within minutes, unable to withstand the pressure of their own lies folding in on themselves. Others clung to their stories until the very end, convinced they could outmaneuver the truth. Bob had spent weeks painting himself as the grieving husband, the man blindsided by tragedy. He had stood before cameras, pleading for justice, while behind closed doors, forensic teams were scraping away at the facade he had built. And now the truth was staring him in the face. Calloway took his seat across from Bob, setting a thick folder on the table between them. He didn't open it. He didn't need to, not yet. The weight of it alone was enough to remind Bob of what was inside. The evidence, the inconsistencies, the things he thought he had buried. Bob exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. A nervous tick. Calloway took note. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial-grade cleaner, but beneath it there was something else. A tension so thick it could be felt in the air. A silent battle had begun. This wasn't just about asking questions. It was about watching, listening, waiting, letting the weight of silence do what words sometimes couldn't. The clock on the wall ticked, each second stretching longer than the last. Calloway didn't rush. He knew that in these moments, suspects often unraveled, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Finally, Bob shifted in his seat. "I don't know what else to tell you," he said, his voice hoarse, frayed at the edges. "I've already answered everything." Calloway let the words settle, then leaned forward just slightly. Not threatening, just close enough to remind Bob that there was nowhere left to run. "We know Jane never left the house alive," Calloway said, his voice calm, measured. "We know she was moved. We know someone tried to clean it up. And we know it wasn't random." Bob's fingers twitched, barely noticeable, but Calloway caught it. Guilt had a way of manifesting in the smallest movements. Still, Bob didn't break. Calloway flipped open the folder. Inside were the photos, the garage, the blood, the fibers from the car, the forensics that told a story far different from the one Bob had rehearsed for the world. Then the final blow, Joseph Gens's confession. The words were printed in black and white, undeniable. A play-by-play of what had happened that night, the transactional coldness of it. Bob's jaw tensed. His eyes flicked to the paper, then away. A man looking for an exit, but there weren't any left. Everything he had tried to keep buried was rising to the surface, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed him whole. The deeper Detective Calloway and his team investigated Bob Bashara, the clearer it became. Jane's murder was not the result of a random act of violence. It was the inevitable conclusion of a double life spiraling out of control, of secrets stacked so high that eventually one of them had to come crashing down. Bob Bashara had spent years cultivating a persona that had fooled nearly everyone. To the world, he was a successful businessman, a devoted husband, and an upstanding member of the Grosse Pointe Park community. He attended charity events, shook hands with local leaders, and carried himself as a man of influence and responsibility. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior, he was something else entirely. As forensic accountants pored over his finances and investigators tracked down leads in Jane's final days, a different Bob Bashara emerged, a man obsessed with control, deception, and a dark underworld he had carefully built beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life. At the center of it all was the basement. It had taken time for investigators to piece together what exactly went on there. The first hints came through whispers. People reluctant to talk, women who had known Bob but were afraid of what speaking out might mean for them. Some had met him under different circumstances, introduced through private groups, enticed by the allure of secrecy. Others had been drawn in slowly, manipulated by his charm, only to find themselves trapped in something far more sinister. What became clear was that Bob Bashara's secret life revolved around domination and submission, a world he had constructed to feed his desires. But this wasn't just about affairs. It was about power, about control in ways that went beyond the ordinary. The basement of a property Bob owned, a bar called Hard Luck Lounge, was his personal dungeon. Hidden away from the pristine image of his suburban life, it was a space designed to serve his fantasies. Investigators found chains, leather restraints, whips, and furniture crafted specifically for bondage scenarios. The room was soundproofed, ensuring that whatever happened inside remained a secret. This was where Bob became Master Bob. For years, he had managed to keep these two lives separate. Jane had not been part of his world, but at some point she had begun to suspect. The text messages recovered from her phone suggested she had been on the verge of uncovering something she wasn't supposed to know. "We need to talk. This can't go on. I don't believe you anymore. You said it was over." Had Jane discovered his relationships with other women? Or had she learned something even worse? Something that had made her a liability? Detective Calloway didn't believe in coincidences. Jane had been taken out of the picture at the exact moment her suspicions about Bob's double life had reached a breaking point. And then there was Joseph Jentz. Bob Bashara hadn't just been unfaithful. He had hired a man to kill his wife. And that was the fatal mistake that unraveled everything. The truth was always there, buried beneath layers of deception, waiting for the right fracture to break through. Jane Bashara had been a devoted wife, a woman who believed in marriage, in family, in the promise of a life built together. But in the end, the greatest threat to her life had not come from a stranger in the dark. It had come from the man she trusted most. Bob Bashara had been playing a role for decades. To the world, he was a businessman, a property owner, a man who stood in front of cameras and smiled alongside his wife. But behind closed doors, he was someone else entirely. Master Bob. A man who needed control, not just in his affairs, but in every aspect of his life. He had designed an existence that catered to his deepest desires, constructing a world beneath the surface of his suburban reality, a world that Jane was never meant to see, but she had. Detective Calloway could almost envision it now. The moment Jane had finally understood who her husband truly was. Had it been an overheard conversation? A bank statement that didn't make sense? A whispered warning from someone who had seen too much? Or had she simply felt it in her gut, the slow unraveling of a marriage that had always been built on lies? The investigation had exposed everything Bob had worked so hard to conceal. His dungeon in the basement of the Hard Luck Lounge. The secret lovers. The women who had called him master. The manipulation. The way he had entwined himself into the lives of those he sought to control. Jane had been the only thing standing in his way. She was the perfect wife, but she was no longer the perfect secret keeper. And for Bob, that had become an unacceptable risk. The betrayal ran deeper than infidelity. It was calculated, cold. The decision of a man who believed he could remove his wife from the equation without consequences, that he could silence her forever and continue his life without interruption. But Bob had underestimated Jane. Even in death, she refused to be erased. The evidence screamed from the walls of their home, from the fibers in her car, from the blood scrubbed too hastily in the garage. The confession of Joseph Gentz, the handyman Bob had coerced into becoming his executioner, had sealed his fate. Bob had orchestrated everything, believing he was in control. But control was an illusion. The weight of his deception had finally collapsed under its own enormity. The final betrayal wasn't Jane's discovery of his secret life. It wasn't even her murder. The final betrayal was Bob's arrogance. He had built a world where he believed he was untouchable. But the moment he decided to dispose of the woman who had once stood beside him, he had unknowingly signed his own downfall. The morning Bob Bashara was arrested, the sky was a heavy slate gray, the kind of winter cold that cut straight to the bone. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of sidewalks, and a thin layer of frost coated the bare branches lining the quiet streets of Grosse Pointe Park. The neighborhood had not yet woken up to the fact that, by the end of the day, one of its most prominent figures would no longer be a free man. Detective Calloway stood at the perimeter of the Bashara property, watching as uniformed officers moved into position. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, gathering enough evidence to ensure that when they put the cuffs on Bob, there would be no loopholes, no escape routes, no room for manipulation. Inside the house, Bob was sitting at his kitchen table, sipping coffee as if it were just another day. His world had been crumbling around him, yet he still clung to the illusion that he could control the narrative, that he could talk his way out of the inevitable. When the knock came at the door, he didn't react right away. He set his cup down carefully, smoothing a hand over his neatly pressed shirt before rising to answer. The moment he saw the officers standing in his doorway, the reality of the situation seemed to settle in. "Robert Bashara, you're under arrest for the murder of Jane Bashara." The words hit like a gavel striking wood. Final. Absolute. For a moment, Bob didn't move. His expression remained composed, but Calloway caught the brief flicker of something behind his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. Even now, he was trying to figure a way out. As the handcuffs locked around his wrists, a quiet murmur began to spread through the street. Neighbors stood at their windows, some venturing onto their porches, watching as the man they had once known as a community leader was escorted from his home in disgrace. Reporters had already begun to swarm the area, cameras flashing, microphones stretched toward officers for statements. The news had traveled fast. Bob Bashara, the grieving husband who had played his role so convincingly, was now the prime suspect in his wife's murder. The fall from grace was swift and brutal. As Bob was placed in the back of the squad car, the neighborhood he had once ruled with his charm and influence now looked at him with suspicion, with quiet judgment. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the villain. Calloway watched as the car pulled away, its taillights disappearing down the street. For the first time in his life, Bob Bashara was no longer in control. The trial awaited, and with it, the reckoning of a man who had spent his life hiding behind a mask. The trial of Bob Bashara was more than just a courtroom battle. It was a final, inescapable reckoning. The illusion he had spent years constructing was gone, ripped apart by evidence, testimony, and his own arrogance. No longer was he the grieving husband, the respected businessman, or the charming philanthropist. Now he was simply a murderer. From the very first day, the prosecution made sure there was no room for doubt. They presented a chilling narrative of deception and control. A man so consumed by his hidden desires and lust for power that he was willing to kill his own wife just to be free of her. They showed the jury the blood evidence from the garage, proving that Jane had died in her own home, at the hands of someone she had trusted. They played Joseph Gentz's confession, where he described in disturbing detail how Bob had manipulated him, offering him money and a car in exchange for carrying out the murder. And then came the final, damning revelations. The women who had once been part of Bob's secret world took the stand. They spoke of the dungeon beneath the Hard Luck Lounge, the place where Bob transformed from a suburban businessman into Master Bob, a man who thrived on control, who built an existence where he was worshipped, obeyed, and feared. Jane had never belonged in that world. She was the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect public partner. But in Bob's eyes, she was a roadblock, someone who stood in the way of the life he truly wanted. When she began questioning his actions, when she started digging into his secrets, she became a liability. And Bob Bashara solved his problems the only way he knew how. The defense scrambled to shift blame onto Gens, painting Bob as a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. They claimed he had been pressured, that Gens had misunderstood, that Bob was merely guilty of making bad decisions, not murder. But the jury saw through it. They deliberated for just a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Bob Bashar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who once reveled in dominance, who built secret rooms to feed his desires, would now spend the rest of his life in a cage he could never escape. Even behind bars, Bob tried to reclaim control. He attempted to have Gens killed from prison, desperate to eliminate the man whose confession had sealed his fate. But the plot failed. His reach, once so vast, had shrunk to nothing. Years passed. The world moved on. Bob appealed his conviction, clinging to the belief that he could still manipulate his way to freedom. But justice never wavered. On August 17, 2020, Bob Bashara died in prison. There was no power left to grasp, no secrets left to hide. He had lived his final years as he had always feared, powerless. The story of Jane Bashara is a haunting reminder that monsters do not always wear masks. Sometimes they smile beside us in family photos. Sometimes they sit at the dinner table, pretending to love us while secretly plotting our demise. Jane never saw the full truth until it was too late. Her death was not just a crime, it was a betrayal of the deepest kind, a betrayal by the man who had vowed to protect her, a betrayal by the life she had trusted. But in the end, truth prevailed. Justice was served, and Bob Bashara, the man who had once controlled everything, died knowing he had lost it all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the story. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found the content interesting, and feel free to leave a comment below if you have any unanswered questions. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. See you in the next video.